Usually, like when you buy fruit from a roadside stand, the only test you apply is rooted entirely in the present moment.
Sure.
You pick up a piece of fruit and you ask a couple of, very immediate questions. Is it ripe? Is it sweet?
Right. It's a completely sensory, immediate evaluation. You're just looking at the present tense reality of the fruit sitting right there in your hand and really nothing more.
Yeah. But then you encounter this incredibly specific, almost murky piece of roadside wisdom that demands something else entirely. And suddenly, uh, you aren't just buying fruit anymore.
No, you're navigating this whole agricultural and diagnostic landscape that reveals, well, a lot about how we judge what is actually real.
Exactly. So welcome to today's deep dive. We are exploring a really fascinating, multi-layered essay titled The Axis of Trust, Beyond the Seeded Proverb. Our mission today is to unpack this strange piece of roadside wisdom and see how it, unravels our deepest assumptions about authenticity, biology, and even human identity.
And just to set expectations before we jump in, as we map out these arguments, the essay builds toward a pretty poignant, politically charged discussion about gender and trans identity.
Right, which is a major shift from watermelons.
Huge shift. And our goal as your guides on this deep dive isn't to take a side or endorse any specific political stance today. We are just here to impartially explore the architecture of the author's argument, laying out the concepts so you can explore how they connect this agricultural quirk to the way society gatekeeps human identity.
So to set the stage, the essay opens with this really vivid image. Picture an older man at a roadside produce stand, maybe off a dusty two-lane highway, and he's hefting a melon in each hand.
And the imagery there is so striking. The author says he's doing this like he was weighing souls rather than just, inspecting produce.
Yeah, and then he hands down this proverb to the customer. He says, "Never trust a seedless watermelon."
Which just has that cadence of something an uncle or a grandfather would say, right? It carries that ring of offhand generational certainty.
The kind of phrase you don't even argue with. You just carry it home in the plastic bag along with the fruit.
Exactly. But when you pause and actually range, because out of all the ways you could judge a fruit, like its heft, its color, the smell of the rind, this specific proverb inexplicably tests its future.
Its ability to reproduce.
Right?
Okay, let's unpack this.
Right.
Because that is such a bizarre metric when you really sit with it. I mean, think about it like a bank demanding a credit score from a piece of fruit.
That's a great way to put it.
It treats trust as a form of collateral. Like the only way to secure a loan of confidence to eat this fruit right now is for the melon to promise 1,000 future green orbs stretching into next summer.
Which makes absolutely no sense considering the lifespan of the transaction. A consumer's entire relationship with a watermelon begins and ends at a picnic table on a July afternoon.
Yeah, nobody eating a slice of watermelon is secretly planning to harvest and plant the seeds.
We actively try to avoid them. We spit them into the grass or, pick them out with a fork.
Right, the seedless variety exists precisely because people wanted the sweetness of the fruit without the interruption of the seeds. They wanted what the plant gives freely.
And yet this underlying suspicion still persists. So the argument being made here is that the suspicion isn't really about the seeds at all. It's about whether the fruit can prove on demand that it belongs to the biological category of things that reproduce.
Like the ability to generate a seed is the entry fee for being considered real or trustworthy.
Exactly.
But the irony of demanding that biological entry fee is that the biology of a seedless watermelon is completely, unapologetically natural.
Totally. There is this tendency to assume seedless fruits are counterfeits or injected with something artificial in some sterile lab by men in white coats who have personally never enjoyed a summer.
Which is such a funny image. But the science paints a totally different picture, doesn't it?
It really does. Biologically, a seedless watermelon is what's called a triploid. And to understand what that means, we have to look at the cellular level. Most living things we interact with, including standard seeded watermelons and humans, are diploid.
Meaning we have two sets of chromosomes.
Right. But a triploid is the offspring of a diploid plant, which has two sets, and a tetraploid plant, which has four. So the offspring inherits 3 sets of chromosomes.
And having an odd number of chromosome sets fundamentally changes how the plant cells behave when it comes time to reproduce.
It just changes the math. Picture a school dance where everyone is told to find a partner. In a plant with an even number of chromosome sets, everyone pairs up smoothly, cell division happens perfectly, and a hard black seed is formed.
Okay, makes sense.
But in a triploid plant with 3 sets, there's always an odd one out. The cellular math refuses to resolve, the chromosomes try to pair up, they fail, and the plant basically just abandons the incredibly energy-intensive process of making a seed.
So instead of forcing a process that won't work, the plant redirects all of that biological energy into the fruit itself. It pours its resources into making more water, more sugar, and that tender red flesh.
It's not broken, it's just operating on its own math.
Right, and crucially, it doesn't do this in a vacuum. The seedless vine doesn't grow in an isolated, sterile tube.
Not at all. It is embedded in a complex, interdependent ecosystem. A seedless watermelon vine still flowers. It absolutely still needs a seeded neighbor growing nearby, and it relies heavily on bees moving pollen.
What the essay beautifully calls gold dust.
Yes. Moving that gold dust from blossom to blossom to trigger its growth, it requires the exact same sun, the same dirt, and the same insect traffic as any other plant. Nothing living becomes itself in isolation.
So if the biology is totally natural and interdependent, why did people start treating seedlessness as a sign of being unnatural? Think about how we actually evaluate our food today.
It's pretty messy.
Historically, we've judged agricultural products on two completely different scales. On one axis, you have the biological function. Does it reproduce or doesn't it? On the other axis, you have the cultivation method. Was it grown with care or was it grown with violence?
Meaning, is it organic, cultivated in rich compost, or is it chemical, grown in depleted soil with synthetic pesticides?
Right, those should be two separate conversations.
Yeah.
But society quietly collapsed these two axes into one single metric. We allowed the presence of seeds to stand in as a false certificate of legitimacy.
Let's ground this in a modern grocery store scenario to see how absurd this collapsed metric really is. Imagine you are standing in the produce aisle. In one bin, you have a seeded watermelon that was raised on synthetic salts, sprayed heavily with chemical pesticides, and shipped thousands of miles.
No.
In the bin right next to it, you have a seedless watermelon grown completely organically on a local farm in beautiful, nutrient-rich soil. Factually, the seedless one is the safer, more carefully cultivated fruit.
Yet, because of this inherited roadside grammar, a shopper will look at the seeded one bristling with black seeds and intuitively trust it more. They trust it simply because it possesses the biological machinery to reproduce.
Exactly. The absence of seeds is read as an absence of realness.
But is it really that deep, though? I mean, wasn't some of that early suspicion just practical confusion? When seedless watermelons first hit grocery store shelves a few generations ago, shoppers were looking at something they had literally never seen before.
That's a very fair point.
Right. It seems plausible that early buyers weren't making a grand philosophical judgment about authenticity. Maybe they just didn't understand why the fruit was empty inside and it just weirded them out.
That historical context is crucial, and the initial reaction was definitely rooted in practical confusion. When these melons first appeared, shoppers did thump them suspiciously. They would actually ask the produce clerks what was wrong with the fruit, treating the seedlessness as a symptom of a disease rather than a natural genetic trait.
Wow, treating it like a disease.
Yeah, but what's fascinating here is the author notes that human suspicion is very often just unfamiliarity, wearing the costume of discernment.
Unfamiliarity wearing the costume of discernment. That is such a powerful line. We think we're being careful and wise, but really, we're just reacting to something new.
Exactly. The fruit itself never changed. The biology was always sound. The only thing that changed was proximity. It just took time, physical contact, and the simple act of people cutting into the fruit and finding it sweet for that initial suspicion to fade.
Once people actually experienced the fruit, the arbitrary biological marker stopped mattering. But this historical habit, using an arbitrary biological trait to judge a thing's fundamental realness, is not isolated to agriculture.
No, the watermelon proverb exposes a much larger, more damaging societal trap.
Yeah. When you realize that realness was never actually about the seeds, a much heavier question emerges. And this is the sentence the whole essay was secretly walking toward. It asks us to look at trans women through this exact same lens.
It's a profound pivot.
The specific phrasing used is, quote, "So, what if a seedless watermelon is merely only a trans woman?"
And that phrasing forces a complete reframing of everything we just discussed. Those two words, merely and only, are doing the heavy lifting of the entire argument.
Because they highlight the cognitive error of mistaking a single biological trait for the whole of a complex life.
Exactly. It's the act of taking someone who is multidimensional and whole and reducing them down to one specific reproductive metric. It essentially declares that they are less than the person standing beside them who happens to possess those specific biological markers.
But here is where the logic of that requirement completely falls apart. We don't apply this reproduction test universally. Nobody stops a woman who has had a hysterectomy at a threshold of womanhood to demand proof that her body can still bear a child.
No, of course not. Nobody asks a postmenopausal woman to provide a fertility timeline to validate her identity.
We don't check a person's chromosome panel at a baby shower. We don't cross-check a marriage certificate against a clinical fertility report before deciding what pronouns to use.
Which means society already knows in almost every other conceivable context that womanhood was never actually a word about seeds or chromosomes. We comfortably allow millions of women to walk through the doorways of society without a single raised eyebrow regarding their reproductive capacity.
So if society knows this in all these other cases, why do we suddenly invent this rigid test for trans women?
That glaring selectivity is the author's devastating conclusion. It proves the rule was never actually a biological imperative. The reproduction test is a pre-approved door.
A door. Okay, explain that.
The proverb, whether it's a rule about watermelon seeds or human chromosomes, exists specifically so that the person holding the door shut can pretend they aren't making a choice.
Ah, I see. It's a way of washing their hands of the prejudice. If you claim it's just biology or just a law of nature, you never have to admit that you're making a conscious, active choice to exclude someone. It absolves the gatekeeper of responsibility.
By turning a social preference into a fake law of nature, the hand on the door remains hidden. So if this modern test is just an exclusionary door built to hide prejudice, what happens if we look past it?
To how humanity historically viewed gender before these specific restrictive doors were ever constructed?
Exactly. To find that perspective, the essay traces things back to the ancient trunk of human culture. It brings in a mythological figure from a still being written tradition named Alkesh.
Right. Alkesh represents the undivided source, existing before the split of cosmic energies like Shiva and Shakti.
And Alkesh is described as wearing every gender, incarnation after incarnation. Sometimes possessing a heavy dark beard, sometimes breasted, sometimes embodying both in the very same evening.
A fluidity that precedes rigid categorization. And the crucial detail in these ancient narratives is that Alkesh never needed to produce a seed or prove a chromosomal makeup in order to be believed or accepted by the community.
No, Alkesh simply needed to be moving, to be warm, to be physically present.
There's this vivid story in the essay to illustrate this. Here's where it gets really interesting. Imagine Alkesh arriving at a busy river crossing, appearing as a woman with a full dark beard, carrying river water in a clay jar shaped like a seed pod.
Okay.
The local villagers who live by the river, who are grounded in the reality of their environment, they don't ask a single question. They just cup their hands and drink the water. They know the water tastes the same and sustains them the same, no matter whose hands are carrying the jar.
Because the locals prioritize the present tense reality of the water. It's only the travelers, the people passing through who are fundamentally unfamiliar with that particular river and its ancient rhythms, who stop and stare.
Yeah, the travelers are the ones who demand explanations. They reach for old, rigid proverbs about what a woman is or isn't supposed to look like.
But the river itself and the people who truly understand it don't slow down for the travelers' questions. The water just keeps moving.
It's like, think about identity and gender as a tree that has been growing for millennia. If you view gender as a late bloom in a very old, deeply rooted tree, then a trans woman isn't some deviation or manufacturing error.
A tree simply has enough seasons and enough genetic complexity to try more than one shape of blossom.
We aren't dealing with a factory churning out identical stamped plastic molds. We're dealing with nature, which is inherently expansive and varied.
A trans woman is no more a deviation from a truer womanhood than a seedless melon is a deviation from a truer melon. Both of them are produced by the exact same mechanism. The text calls it the unstoppable insistence of being alive.
The unstoppable insistence of being alive. I love that. The tree produces the new bloom on purpose, utilizing its own chromosomes, responding to its own weather, engaged in its own unhurried conversation with time.
But there is a quiet trap here. If we accept this new blossom, do we only accept it because it is somehow better or more impressive than the standard?
Right. That is the trap of exceptionalism, which in agriculture is known as hybrid vigor.
Yes, hybrid vigor. It is a biological fact that triploid melons, the seedless ones, actually do carry more concentrated sugars. They frequently have a more even internal grain and a noticeably longer shelf life.
They are, by many metrics, exceptionally good fruit.
But the author warns against accepting them because they are exceptional. Because requiring someone to be exceptional just to be accepted is just the old reproduction test wearing a nicer coat.
If society says she's acceptable because she's so impressive or so talented or so beautiful, or if a consumer says this fruit is welcome on my table because its extraordinary sweetness offsets the fact that it lacks seeds, you are still demanding an entry fee.
Precisely. You are still forcing them to buy their way into the category of real. A watermelon gets to simply, unremarkably be a watermelon, regardless of its sugar content. And a trans woman gets to simply, unremarkably be a woman.
Neither owes the room a bonus reason or an apology for existing. But, and this is a big but, if we completely throw out the reproduction test, and we throw out the chromosome test, and we refuse to demand exceptionalism as an entry fee, how do we actually establish trust? I mean, if we rely on categories and tests because the world is chaotic. Without these markers, how do we know what is real?
That is the most vital question to answer. Because dismantling a false test requires replacing it with a true one. To find the true axis of trust, the author brings us right back down to the dirt. Back to the farmer standing in the middle of the melon patch.
Okay, what does the farmer do?
If you ask a seasoned farmer how they decide which melon is ripe and ready to be trusted, they don't ask the fruit to produce its family tree. They don't demand a notarized receipt from the bees that pollinated the blossom.
They interact with the physical object. They thump it with the palm of their hand.
They thump it, and they listen for a very specific, low, hollow note that indicates the water content is perfect. They roll the melon over and look for the pale, buttery patch on the underside where it sat in the dirt, proving it was given enough time to ripen on the vine.
They look for the dry curl of the tendril near the stem. Every single reliable metric they use is read directly off the fruit itself, in physical space, right in that exact moment.
The true axis of trust is built entirely in the present tense.
It's entirely about physical proximity and observation. And mapping that directly onto human relationships really changes everything. Think about how you actually build trust with a friend, a coworker, or a partner. You didn't decide to trust them because a medical committee reviewed their reproductive paperwork.
No, you built that trust the slow, undeniable way, through time spent sitting in the same room, through accumulating hundreds of small present tense honesties, by tasting the sweetness of that person's company.
Observing how they treat others, listening to the resonance of their character again and again until doubt simply has nowhere left to stand. Trust happens in the tasting, not in the tracing.
All those other diagnostic tests, the seed test, the chromosome test, the rigid proverbs, they are just lazy shortcuts. They are invented by people who don't want to do the slower, present tense work of actually cutting into the reality of a person and tasting for themselves.
It takes effort to sit with someone and listen for that hollow note of authenticity. It's much easier to just stand at a distance and demand paperwork. But the paperwork never actually tells you if the fruit is sweet.
Never.
So, synthesizing this whole journey, we started at a dusty roadside fruit stand with an offhand comment about watermelons, and we ended up entirely dismantling the arbitrary biological gates we build to keep human authenticity locked away.
We really did.
The inherited grammar of prejudice just keeps repeating itself, long after the world has moved on and the science has evolved. But despite all those rigid rules and arbitrary tests, the vine just keeps doing what it does. It keeps turning ordinary sunlight into sugar, freely offering it to anyone willing to cut in far enough to taste it.
It's a beautiful conclusion about human resilience. But if we take this argument seriously, that true trust and true authenticity require present tense proximity, sitting in the same room and directly observing the reality of another person, it leaves us with a highly provocative challenge for our modern lives.
How so? Like what kind of challenge?
Well, think about the environment we live in now. How does this requirement for physical, present tense proximity completely change our approach to trust in the digital age?
Oh, wow. That's a good point.
We interact almost exclusively with digital paperwork now. Online labels, curated profiles, algorithmic categorizations. We rarely engage with a person's physical, present tense self before we decide to trust or judge them. If true trust requires thumping the melon and tasting the fruit, how can we truly trust anything or anyone when all we ever see is their digital seed?
Are we just constantly checking digital paperwork instead of actually tasting the fruit? We are living in a world of labels without proximity. To you, our listener, we hope you take that question with you today. Keep seeking out the sweetness in the present tense, and maybe the next time you're handed a test or an offhand proverb, pause to ask what it's really measuring and who it was designed to exclude. Remember, when you're standing at the roadside stand of life, sometimes the most authentic, trustworthy thing you can do is just enjoy the complex, unhurried reality of what is sitting right there in your hand. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.